The world has been watching a dangerous pattern unfold in the Middle East. But every so often, a single act changes the atmosphere entirely. A missile launch is never just a missile launch. Sometimes it is a message, sometimes a warning, and sometimes it is a sign that the old rules of deterrence are starting to break down. And when Iran launches ballistic missiles toward U.S. forces and military bases, the significance goes far beyond the immediate target. It is not only about one strike, one base, or one headline. It is about the balance of power in a region already under pressure, the credibility of American deterrence, the limits of Israeli defense planning, the role of Gulf security, and the risk that a local confrontation could expand into something much wider, much more unstable, and much harder to contain. What makes this moment so serious is not simply the act itself, but the message behind it. Iran is not operating in a vacuum. It is responding to a strategic environment shaped by repeated airstrikes, escalating rhetoric, shifting alliances, and a widening sense that every side is trying to force the other into a position of weakness without crossing the point of no return. That is what makes this kind of crisis so difficult to read. The shots are loud, but the calculations underneath are even louder. In modern conflict, what matters is not only what happens on the battlefield, but what each side believes the other side is willing to absorb, and how long each side can keep absorbing it before the political cost becomes too high. If you step back and look at the broader picture, the first thing you notice is that Iran's missile capability has long been one of the central pillars of its deterrence strategy. Tehran understands something that many of its adversaries understand as well. It does not need to match the United States ship for ship, jet for jet, or base for base. It needs to create enough uncertainty, enough cost, and enough risk that American planners must constantly think twice before escalating further. That is the essence of asymmetric warfare. It is not about defeating a superpower in the traditional sense. It is about making that superpower pay a price that is politically, militarily, and economically uncomfortable enough to alter its decisions. And that is why the symbolism of a ballistic missile launch matters so much. Ballistic missiles are not improvised weapons. They are not a spontaneous reaction in the heat of the moment. They are a deliberate strategic instrument, one that signals planning, resolve, and a willingness to expand the theater of confrontation. When a state uses them against American military positions, it is saying something very direct. We can reach your assets. We can threaten your calculations, and we can disrupt the assumption that distance alone provides safety. That assumption is crucial. For decades, U.S. military planning has relied heavily on geography, layered defense, and overwhelming logistical reach. American bases in the region were designed to project power, reassure allies, and contain adversaries. But every regional war eventually raises the same uncomfortable question. What happens when the force projection network itself becomes the target? Suddenly, the same bases that were meant to anchor deterrence become liabilities that must be defended, reinforced, and constantly reevaluated. Suddenly, the cost of maintaining presence rises dramatically, and that is where this crisis becomes more than a regional exchange. It becomes a global strategic problem. Because anytime the United States is forced to defend its military footprint in the Middle East under missile threat, it has ripple effects far beyond the immediate battlefield. It affects the air defense inventory. It affects deployment cycles. It affects strategic reserves. It affects political debate in Washington. It affects the confidence of allies who depend on American guarantees. It affects energy markets, insurance costs, shipping routes, and investor expectations. A missile fired at a U.S. base may last only minutes, but the consequences can last weeks, months, or even longer. And then there is the psychological dimension, which is often underestimated. In crises like this, governments do not only respond to physical damage, they respond to perception. They respond to whether they appear weak or strong, isolated or supported, in control or reactive. Iran knows this. The United States knows this. Israel knows this. The Gulf states know this. Everyone involved is watching everyone else, not just for the next strike, but for the next decision. That is why these developments always come with two parallel conversations. One is military, the other is political. On the military side, the questions are obvious. How many missiles were launched? What type of missiles were used? How many were intercepted? What is the state of the defense systems, and how much escalation can each side sustain? On the political side, the questions are more difficult. Who wants a deal? Who wants pressure? Who wants deterrence? And who believes that only force will change the other side's behavior? In the case of Iran, the answer is rarely simple. Tehran often presents itself as a state that does not seek war, but that will respond forcefully if it believes its sovereignty, leadership, or strategic interests are under direct threat. That is a central feature of Iranian doctrine. It is not merely reactive, it is calibrated. It seeks to communicate resolve without necessarily inviting total war. But once missiles are launched at U.S. forces or bases, the risk of miscalculation rises sharply. A response that is meant to be limited can be interpreted as the start of a wider campaign. A defensive move can be read as preparation for offense. A warning can be mistaken for a bluff. And in the fog of crisis, those mistakes can become very expensive very quickly. It is also important to understand how the regional environment magnifies these dangers. The Middle East is not one single front. It is a network of overlapping theaters. There is the Gulf, there is Iraq, there is Syria, there is Lebanon, there is the Red Sea, there is the maritime corridor that connects energy producers to global markets. There are U.S. troops, allied forces, proxy networks, air defense systems, naval assets, intelligence platforms, and political pressure points all interlinked. So when Iran fires at American forces, it is never only about one location. It is about testing the entire architecture. And that architecture is under strain. One reason it is under strain is that the region is already fatigued by conflict. States have been managing crises for years, sometimes even decades, but fatigue eventually changes decision-making. Leaders may still issue strong statements, but the appetite for open-ended escalation is usually much lower than the rhetoric suggests. That creates a strange environment where everyone talks tough, but behind the scenes, everyone is looking for off-ramps. The problem is that off-ramps are not always obvious, and if both sides think the other side must blink first, then even a narrow crisis can drag on longer than anyone expected. Another reason is that military technology has changed the meaning of distance. A base that once felt safely remote may now be within range of increasingly sophisticated missile systems. That does not mean every missile will succeed. Interception remains possible, and in many cases highly effective. But defense is not the same as immunity. Modern air defense systems are powerful, but they are also finite. They can be saturated, depleted, or stretched. Every interceptor used is an expensive resource that must be replaced. Every layer of defense must be reloaded. Every successful interception may still leave the underlying strategic problem unresolved. That is why analysts pay such close attention to expenditure rates in these conflicts. It is not only about whether a missile is intercepted. It is about what the interception costs, how many interceptors are available, how long replenishment will take, and whether the attacking side can outlast the defender's supply. In modern warfare, the side that can force the other side into a resource trap often gains leverage even without a decisive battlefield victory. This is one reason missile warfare has become such a powerful tool for states that cannot compete conventionally with the United States. And the United States, for its part, is now facing a classic strategic dilemma. If it responds too strongly, it risks widening the war. If it responds too cautiously, it risks looking vulnerable. If it surges forces, it may deter future attacks. But it also reinforces the image of a region sliding deeper into confrontation. If it pulls back, it may reduce immediate exposure, but it can also embolden adversaries and unsettle allies. This is the trap of great power crisis management. Every option has a cost, every move sends a signal, and every signal is interpreted through the lens of credibility. That is why these missile launches matter so much in the broader competition over regional order. Iran does not need to destroy the American military presence in the Middle East to claim a strategic win. It only needs to convince Washington that the cost of continued pressure is climbing. It only needs to show that no base is fully safe, no patrol is fully protected, and no escalation can be assumed to remain contained. That alone can reshape strategic thinking. At the same time, we should be careful not to exaggerate. Missile launches do not automatically translate into strategic victory. They do not erase American power. They do not end the capacity of the United States to respond. They do not guarantee that regional actors will abandon Washington. In fact, in some cases, they can produce the opposite effect. More coordination, more force posture adjustments, more defense cooperation, more intelligence sharing, and more pressure on the attacking state. So the real impact is usually mixed. It depends on what happens next. And what happens next depends on diplomacy as much as firepower. That may sound counterintuitive during a missile crisis, but it is true. The loudest moments in war often produce the strongest behind-the-scenes diplomatic activity. Messages are sent through intermediaries. Red lines are quietly clarified. Third parties step in. Back channels open. Publicly, governments may sound immovable. Privately, they may already be calculating how to stop the next round. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of modern conflict. The sharper the military exchange, the more urgent the diplomatic channel becomes, even if neither side wants to admit it publicly. There is also a wider strategic lesson here. The more heavily a region depends on external military protection, the more vulnerable it becomes when that protection is challenged. Gulf security, maritime security, and energy security are all tightly connected. When missiles fly, energy markets react. When markets react, political pressure rises in capitals far beyond the Middle East. Consumers feel it. Shipping companies feel it. Industrial supply chains feel it. And that global sensitivity is exactly why regional conflict can never remain purely regional for long. This is one of the reasons the Strait of Hormuz continues to matter so deeply in any Iran crisis. Even the threat of disruption there can send shockwaves through global markets. The same is true for attacks on infrastructure, bases, or shipping lanes. The battlefield may be local, but the consequences are global. That is a feature of the modern world, not a bug. Interdependence creates resilience, but it also creates vulnerability. A single flashpoint can now affect the price of fuel in one continent, the stability of governments in another, and the strategic calculations of major powers everywhere. And speaking of major powers, this is where the international dimension becomes especially important. China, Russia, Europe, the Gulf states, and the United States all have interests that are affected by any widening conflict with Iran. Some want stability above all. Some want leverage. Some want to prevent American dominance. Some want to protect trade. Some want to preserve deterrence. Some want to avoid any precedent that encourages further regional militarization. None of them are looking at this from a purely neutral standpoint. Every major player is balancing principle against interest and stability against advantage. That makes the crisis not only a military contest, but a contest over the future of order itself. Because one of the deepest questions in this confrontation is whether the old system of regional security is still functioning. For years, the Middle East has relied on a mix of U.S. military presence, local alliances, deterrence by punishment, and selective diplomacy. But every major escalation exposes the limits of that system. It shows how quickly local actors can draw in global powers, how rapidly a single strike can trigger multiple fronts, and how difficult it is to achieve de-escalation once prestige and credibility are on the line. In practical terms, this means the world is watching for three things now. First, whether Iran continues to use missile pressure as part of a longer campaign. Second, whether the United States chooses a limited response or a broader one. And third, whether any diplomatic channel can reduce the risk of a direct clash between forces that neither side may fully want, but both sides may feel compelled to prepare for. There is a human side to this too, and it should not be lost. Behind the headlines are pilots, soldiers, sailors, air defense crews, civilians, port workers, oil market analysts, and families waiting for updates. These are not abstract moves on a map. Every escalation carries uncertainty for people who may never appear on television. That is one reason serious geopolitical analysis matters. It helps separate strategy from spectacle. It helps explain why leaders act the way they do. And it reminds us that the language of power always has real human consequences. At the same time, it is worth remembering that not every display of force produces the outcome the attacker expects. A missile launch can strengthen deterrence, but it can also provoke countermeasures. It can increase bargaining power, but it can also harden opposition. It can project strength, but it can also encourage opponents to prepare for a longer struggle. In other words, force is never just force. It is a political instrument, and like all political instruments, its effects depend on timing, context, and the opponent's interpretation. That is the heart of the issue here. Iran's missile launch toward U.S. forces and bases is not merely an act of retaliation. It is an attempt to shape the strategic environment. It is designed to say that Iran cannot be ignored, cannot be pressured without consequence, and cannot be contained by assumptions that its reach is limited to its immediate neighborhood. Whether that message succeeds depends on how the United States, its allies, and the wider international system respond. And that response will reveal a great deal about the era we are living in. We are entering a period where regional wars are more connected, deterrence is more fragile, and technology has made even distant assets vulnerable. That means the old idea of controlled escalation is harder to maintain. It means diplomacy must work faster, clearer, and under far more pressure. It means leaders need not only military strength, but strategic discipline. And it means the world is increasingly dependent on whether rival powers can still recognize the point at which pressure turns into catastrophe. Because that is the real danger in moments like this. Not only the missiles themselves, but the chain reaction they can trigger. Not only the attack, but the response to the attack. Not only the battlefield, but the perceptions that shape the next move. And once that chain reaction begins, it can become much harder to stop than anyone in the first hours imagined. So when we look at Iran's ballistic missile launch against U.S. forces and military bases, we should see more than a headline. We should see a warning about the fragility of deterrence, the limits of military dominance, and the growing interconnectedness of global security. We should see a reminder that power today is not just measured by how much force a state can project, but by how carefully it can avoid being pulled into a wider conflict it may not be able to control. And perhaps that is the hardest lesson of all. In a world full of rival ambitions, strategic mistrust, and rapid escalation, the true test of leadership is not only the ability to strike back, it is the ability to stop the cycle before it expands beyond anyone's control. The future of diplomacy will depend on that kind of restraint. And the future of global stability may depend on whether the great powers still have the patience, the flexibility, and the wisdom to choose it.